The bullet had missed Naomi Dalton by 3 inches, and she had not flinched. That was the first thing Ira Fairchild noticed about her, not the dark coil of hair coming loose from its pin, not the sun-browned skin stretched over sharp cheekbones, not even the Winchester she swung back onto her shoulder with the casual ease of a woman who had been carrying rifles before she had been carrying anything else. He noticed that she had not flinched. The shot had come from the ridge above Calico Creek, had split the air beside her ear like a hornet made of lead, and she had simply shifted her weight, pivoted, and fired back without so much as drawing a hard breath. Then she had kept walking toward the trading post as though the whole world had not just tried to kill her. It was the summer of 1882, and the town of Harlan's Crossing, Texas, was the kind of place that chewed through people and spit out bones. Sitting at the junction of 2 cattle trails and 1 territorial dispute that had never been properly settled, it attracted the sort of men who lived by improvisation and left by consequence. The honest folks, the blacksmith, the dry goods merchant, the schoolteacher who had arrived in March and was already looking pale around the eyes, they kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves. Everyone else kept loaded. Naomi Dalton had been in Harlan's Crossing for 11 months. She had come with her father's deed to a parcel of land 5 miles south of town, a deed her father had sent her to claim after he died coughing into a cloth in a rooming house in San Antonio, and she had come alone. She was 26 years old. She ran 40 head of cattle, employed no one, and had traded a pair of silver earrings for her mule because she had not had enough coin at the time. She had named the mule Ezekiel, though she called him nothing at all when she was angry with him, which was frequently. She did not know Ira Fairchild from any other man in this town when she walked into the trading post that afternoon, dust on her boots and a fresh dent in her hat brim from where she had shoved it back to take her shot at the ridge. She went straight to the counter, set a list on the wood and said, "I need this filled today, and I need it on credit until the 1st of August." Gus Whitfield, who ran the trading post and had a habit of making people feel small before he agreed to help them, looked at her list and then looked at her. "Credit," he repeated. "That is what I said. You got any collateral besides that 40-head operation you've been running into the ground?" Naomi did not raise her voice. "My operation is not running into the ground. My operation is running exactly as planned. I have a buyer arranged in Abilene and the drive starts in 3 weeks. You will have your money by September." She did not see Ira until she turned from the counter to wait for Whitfield's answer, and then she nearly walked into him. He was tall, not pretentiously tall, but enough that she had to look up slightly, which she resented immediately. With a jaw that had been broken once and healed crooked and dark eyes that were doing something unusual. They were not measuring her the way men's eyes usually measured her, that slow up and down accounting of whether she was worth engaging. They were simply watching her with what appeared to be genuine interest, the way you watch something you had not expected to see. "Pardon me," he said and stepped aside. "You were not in my way," she said. "No, but you looked like you needed the space regardless." She stared at him for a moment, trying to determine if that was condescension or something else. She could not tell. She turned back to Whitfield and repeated her request, and Whitfield, who had apparently been waiting to see how this stranger would react before making his own assessment, agreed to the credit. Naomi gathered her list of supplies: salt, flour, a small tin of black powder, 3 lengths of rope, and a bottle of liniment she used for the cattle's joints in the dry heat, and carried them to the door. Ira Fairchild opened it, not grandly, not as a statement. Just because he was standing near it and she was carrying things and it seemed logical. "You are the woman from the Creek Road," he said. "The one with the Hereford crosses." She stopped. "People talk about me. Only in passing. They say you run the place alone. That is true. They say you ought not to be doing it. That," she said, "is what they always say." She walked through the door. She did not think about him again until that evening when she was checking fence line along the southern pasture and found 3 posts pulled clean from the ground. Not knocked loose by cattle, pulled. There were boot tracks in the dry earth, 2 sets, and the marks where the posts had been lifted by human hands. She stood in the failing light and looked at the ruined fence and felt the particular cold anger that came not from surprise but from recognition. This had been done before, in smaller ways. A water trough tipped on its side. A gate latch filed partway through so it broke when she opened it. Small violences meant to wear her down. She repaired what she could before full dark, driving the posts back with a rock because she had not brought the proper mallet, and she was still at it when she heard a horse on the road. She did not look up from her work. "You need a hand with that," said a voice she recognized after a moment as belonging to the man from the trading post. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him dismount. She heard him tie his horse to the top rail of the fence 20 yards north. Then she heard him walking toward her unhurried, and she finally looked up. "I said I did not need help." "I know," Ira Fairchild said. He crouched down, picked up one of the fence posts that was still loose, and drove it into the ground with one methodical push, testing its hold. "I heard you." She watched him. She did not send him away again because she was pragmatic above almost everything else, and the fence needed finishing, and her hands were raw from the rock. They worked in silence for 40 minutes, and when the last post was set and the wire was restrung, she straightened and looked at what they had done. "Why did you follow me?" she said. "I did not follow you. I was riding south anyway." "Your horse is facing north," she said. "Has been since you tied him." He looked at the horse, then back at her. The smallest possible smile crossed his face, the kind that was not trying to charm but was just helpless against itself. "I heard what Whitfield said to you in the trading post about running your operation into the ground. I did not like how he said it." "I do not need defending," she said flatly. "I know," he said again, with the same simple acknowledgement that she found unexpectedly difficult to argue with. "I was not defending you. I was just making myself available in case something needed doing. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the day had turned the sky behind the ridge a deep orange red, and his face was half in shadow, and she was tired in the way she was always tired at the end of these long days, the kind that went past her bones and settled somewhere deeper. "What do you do?" she said. It was not quite a question. "A little of most things," he said. "I was a trail hand for 6 years. Before that I worked cattle in New Mexico. I have been in Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks." "Why, I heard there was work." "For whom?" His jaw tightened just briefly. "Not for the man who pulled your fence posts, if that is what you are asking." "I am not employed by anyone in this town yet." She studied him another moment, then bent and picked up her tools and walked back toward the barn without another word. He untied his horse and rode north. She told herself she was glad he was gone. His name came up 3 days later when she was in town buying grain, and the blacksmith, a wide-armed man named Calvin Briggs, mentioned that Ira Fairchild had taken up temporary board at the rooming house and had fixed 2 wagon wheels and a harness rig in exchange for his room. "Knows his way around iron," Calvin said, without particular judgment. "Quiet man. Keeps to himself. Reads if you can credit it." Naomi filed this away and did not comment on it. The next incident with her fence line was worse. She came out at dawn to find not just posts pulled, but an entire section of wire cut in a long slash, and 4 of her Hereford crosses gone through the gap. She tracked them 2 miles south before she found them scattered in a dry wash, unhurt but spooked, and she spent the better part of the morning getting them back. By the time she returned to the gap in the fence, she was dust-covered and furious and behind on everything. She rode into town in the afternoon, went to the sheriff's office, and gave a careful accounting of what had happened. Sheriff Prout, a man of about 50 with a drinker's eyes and the kind of careful neutrality that functioned more as cowardice than fairness, wrote down what she said and told her he would look into it. He had told her he would look into it twice before. On her way out, she passed Ira Fairchild coming in the opposite direction down the main street. He was leading a horse with a lame forefoot and carrying a set of saddlebags over one shoulder, and he was looking at the horse's leg with concentration. He looked up when she was nearly past him. "You have cattle in a dry wash about 2 miles south," he said. "I just retrieved them." Something shifted in his face. "Someone cut your wire." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You go to the sheriff?" "Yes." Another pause. "Did he?" "No," she said. She kept walking. She heard him say something behind her, quiet enough that she could not make out the words, and she did not ask him to repeat them. That evening he appeared at her gate. She was sitting on her porch in the last of the daylight, going over her ledger, and she saw him coming up the road and felt something move in her chest that she immediately identified and immediately ignored. She was not a woman who indulged that kind of thing. She had indulged it once, 6 years ago, with a man in San Antonio who had found her self-sufficiency charming right up until it became inconvenient, and she had learned her lesson with the clean efficiency of someone who only needed one bad experience to understand a principle. "I do not need company," she said, before he reached the gate. He stopped at the gate and took his hat off, not in a performative way, just in the way that some men did when they were about to say something they meant. "I know you do not. I wanted to ask you something." She waited. "Someone is working against you," he said. "The fence, the cattle, was there other things before?" She looked at him steadily. "The trough, a latch, small things at first." He nodded slowly, and she could see him thinking. "You know who it is?" "I have my suspicions," she said. "There is a man named Harrow, Court Harrow. He ran cattle on this land before my father filed the deed. The deed is legitimate. I have had 2 lawyers verify it, but Harrow does not see it that way. He has made his feelings known in several ways, all of them short of being provable." "How short of provable?" "The boot tracks by my fence could belong to anyone. No one saw his men at the wash. He is careful." Ira put his hat back on. He looked at the land around her, the small, well-built house, the barn she had repaired herself, the pasture where the Hereford crosses moved slow and dark in the failing light. He looked at all of it with an expression she could not fully read, but that contained something that felt like respect. "I would like to work for you," he said, "through the drive to Abilene. I know cattle and I know trail and I can be useful. I will take standard trail wages and no more." She stared at him. "Why?" "The simplest possible answer. Because what is happening to you is not right, and I am not employed elsewhere and I can be of use." "I told you I do not need." "You told me you do not need defending," he said. "This is not defending you, this is working. There is a difference, I believe I mentioned that." She looked at him for a long time. The ledger was open on her knee, and she had already done the arithmetic a dozen times in her head, and she knew she needed at least 2 more hands for the drive and had funds for one if she managed carefully. "What is your trail rate?" she asked. He told her. It was reasonable, fair, even. "I will consider it," she said. She hired him the next morning. She made the terms clear at breakfast. She had made biscuits because she was not a rude woman even when she was trying to be sitting across the rough table from him in the kitchen while the coffee pot worked on the stove. No drinking on her property. Work begins at first light and ends when the work is done. She made the decisions. He carried them out. If he disagreed with her judgment, he could say so once, clearly, and she would consider it, and then she would still make her own decision. He listened to all of it without interrupting. "That is fair," he said. She had expected at least one objection. The lack of one unsettled her in a way she did not examine. She handed him a biscuit and poured his coffee and showed him the barn and told him she expected the water line to the south pasture checked by noon. He went and checked it. The days settled into a rhythm. Ira Fairchild was, as advertised, useful. He was not showy about it. There was no performance of effort, no obvious wanting to be seen working hard. He simply worked from first light to the last of it, and he did it with a thoroughness that was its own kind of quiet. He found a split beam in the barn roof she had not noticed. He reinforced the gate hinges. He repaired the water line at the south pasture and found a secondary crack she had not noticed and fixed that too. He did not congratulate himself for any of it, and he talked to her. Not constantly, not filling silence for the sake of it, but with a kind of directness that she found she did not know how to deflect. He asked about the cattle, about her drive plan, about the terrain between Harlan's Crossing and Abilene. He asked smart questions, questions that showed he was already thinking several days ahead of where they stood. She answered them honestly because she could not think of a reason not to. One evening, about a week after he started, she was sitting on the fence rail watching the Herefords settle for the night, and he came and sat on the rail beside her, not close, just near, and they were quiet for a while, and then he said, "How long were you in San Antonio?" She looked at him sidelong. 7 years, after my mother died. And your father was already here. My father filed the claim 3 years ago, before he was sick enough to know he might not use it. He sent me the deed in a letter in February with a note that said, "This is yours now, Naomi. He died before I arrived." A pause. I never met anyone who gave something away as freely as he gave things away. It was not always a useful quality in him. Ira was quiet for a moment. "You miss him?" "Yes." She said it plainly, without apology. She had found that grief was most manageable when you did not dress it up. "I miss him, and I am also sometimes angry with him for not living, which is not rational but is nevertheless true." "That is perfectly rational," Ira said. She looked at him again. He was watching the cattle, profile quiet in the evening light, and she thought, with the part of her mind she tried to keep under strict supervision, that he was a handsome man in an undemonstrative way. Not beautiful the way some men tried to be. Just well-made, like a good piece of work with nothing wasted. "What about your family?" she said. "My father runs a farm in Missouri," he said. "My mother died when I was 12. I have a younger brother who is more sensible than I am and has already made himself a decent life." He said it without bitterness or self-pity, just factually. "I have been moving west for about 9 years. Some men are built for settling. I have been working on becoming one." "You do not sound convinced." He looked at her then, and something in his eyes was careful and also direct. "I am becoming more convinced," he said. "The longer I stay somewhere good, the more it makes sense." She looked away. She was aware that the something in her chest, the thing she had decided to ignore, was becoming harder to ignore. "Do not do that," she said. "Do what?" "Say things like that in that way." A long pause. "What way is that?" "You know what way." He was quiet for a moment, then gently, "I am not trying to make you uncomfortable." "I know you are not," she said. "That is the problem." She got down from the fence and went inside. She lay awake for a while that night, which was unusual for her. She was generally too tired by evening for anything except sleep. But she lay and looked at the ceiling and had an honest conversation with herself, the kind she sometimes needed to have, and she admitted that she liked him, not just as a worker. She liked the way he was in the world, the quietness of him, the absence of performance, the fact that he had not once, in all their days working side by side, made her feel that she was doing anything wrong simply by existing and having opinions and knowing what she was doing. He had not once told her to be easier. He had not once implied she was too much. He had simply worked beside her as though that was entirely normal, which it was, and which she was aware most men around her did not seem to understand. She was not soft. She had never been soft. Her mother had been soft, beautiful, and trembling like something made for indoor light, and she had died at 34 of a fever that the doctor had said was made worse by a constitution unequipped for hardship. Naomi had loved her mother completely, and had understood even as a child that she herself was made differently. She had her father's stubbornness, her father's jaw, her father's way of walking into a thing straight on rather than around it. She had been told many times and in many ways that this made her difficult, hard, unfeminine. She had listened to all of this and concluded that the people saying it were simply bothered by the fact that she would not become convenient for them. She told herself she was not going to fall in love with Ira Fairchild, and she almost believed it. 2 weeks before the drive, Court Harrow came to call. Naomi saw him coming from the upper pasture, where she and Ira were mending the last of the wire damage. A third incident, this one along the east line, and they had both seen the boot tracks and the tool marks and said nothing to each other because there was nothing new to say. She saw the dust of 3 riders on the road and climbed the fence post to get a better look and recognized Harrow's roan horse and his particular way of sitting a saddle, as if the horse owed him something. "Stay back," she said to Ira. "Naomi," I said, "stay back. This is my land and he is coming to my gate and I will speak to him myself." She looked at him. "That was one of my rules." His jaw was tight, but he stayed. Harrow was a man of about 50, with the kind of face that had been commanding at one point and was now just blunt. He had money, more money than anyone else around Harlan's Crossing, and he spent it in the small ways powerful men spend money, which is to say he spent it making sure everyone around him was inconvenienced enough to remain dependent. He pulled up at her gate and did not dismount, which was its own statement. "Miss Dalton," he said, "Mr. Harrow, I have come to make you a final offer on this land." He said final in the way that was meant to imply something beyond the financial. "My answer has not changed," she said. "The drive you are planning," he said, "is going to fail. Trail to Abilene is rough country. Things happen on trails. Stock wanders. Men get hurt." He looked past her at Ira, who was still standing by the fence with his hat in his hand and his face entirely still. "Even men who work for you." "That sounds like a threat," Naomi said. "It sounds like concern," Harrow said. "I'm a concerned neighbor." "You are not my neighbor. You are a man who believes my father's legal deed is an inconvenience to your interests, and I am a woman who has the deed in question in my possession and will use it." She stepped to the gate but did not open it. "If another fence post is pulled or another head of my cattle goes missing, I will ride to the county seat myself and file a full report with documentation. I have been keeping documentation, Mr. Harrow. Every incident, every date, every boot track." She held his gaze. "I would encourage you to adjust your activities accordingly." Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ira again and something shifted behind his eyes that was not quite worry but was adjacent to it. "You have picked an interesting moment to take on hands," he said to Naomi. "I pick my moments," she said, "as I see fit." He turned his roan without another word and rode back the way he had come, his two men following. Naomi watched them until the dust settled. Then she turned back to the fence. Ira was watching her. "You have been keeping documentation," he said. "Yes, since the first incident." "You did not mention that to me." "I did not need to. It was my documentation to keep." She picked up the wire stretcher and went back to work. After a moment she heard him do the same. Then, quietly, he said, "That was very well done." She said nothing, but she felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real heat of morning, and she let it. There were 10 days before the drive when they sat together by the fire after supper for the first time, not by design, but by circumstance, because the evening had gone cool faster than expected, and there was wood already laid, and neither of them had anywhere else to be. She had brought her ledger, and he had produced from his saddlebag a battered copy of a book she had to lean over to read the spine of. It was a book of essays by a man named Emerson. "You actually read," she said. "Calvin Briggs told you." He did. He looked at the book and then at her. "Does it surprise you?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes and no," she said. "Most men I have met out here are either educated and useless or capable and willfully ignorant. You seem to be neither." "My mother was a school teacher," he said. "She made it very clear that reading was not optional." "What do you read?" "Whatever I can find, essays, history, trail maps, almanacs. Whatever the last person left behind in whatever room I was sleeping in." He turned the book over in his hands. "Emerson argues that every man contains within himself everything he needs to understand his own life. I disagree with him half the time, but I find it useful to argue with something." She looked at him with an interest she was no longer trying to entirely conceal. "You disagree with Emerson, don't you?" She had, in fact, read one of Emerson's essays in a magazine years ago in San Antonio, and she had had distinct opinions about it, which she had shared with no one because there had been no one to share them with. She said carefully, "His idea of self-reliance seems to assume that the self doing the relying is left alone long enough to develop into something worth relying on. Most people I know have had to do their becoming in the middle of being pulled apart." He looked at her with an expression that was still and full at the same time, and he said, very quietly, "Yes, exactly. The fire popped and sent a thread of sparks upward into the dark. She looked away, back at her ledger, but she could not make the numbers mean anything for several minutes. The night before she would later remember as the first time she understood what was happening between them. They had a disagreement. It was about the route. She had planned a route to Abilene that cut northeast through broken country, avoiding the main trail, because the main trail was heavily used, and the stock prices at the end of it reflected that competition. Ira had studied her map and had a different view. The broken country would cost them 4 days at minimum and put the cattle through rough terrain in midsummer heat. She said the extra days were worth it for the price advantage. He said the cattle would arrive thin and her price advantage would disappear. She said she had made this calculation. He said she had made it on paper, and there was a difference between paper and ground. They went back and forth for 20 minutes, each of them holding their position, and neither of them raised their voice, but neither of them gave an inch. Finally, she said, "I told you when you came to work here that I make the decisions. This is my decision." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is. I have said my piece once. I will ride whatever route you set." He folded the map and set it on the table between them. "But I want you to know that I think you are wrong, and I am saying so not because I want to take something from you, but because I respect you enough to be honest." She looked at the map. Then she looked at him. Then she picked the map up and looked at it again for a long time. "Show me the water sources on the main trail," she said. He showed her. She looked at them for a while. She considered the difference in price, the condition of the cattle, the time of year, the heat. "We will take the main trail," she said, "but we will start 2 weeks earlier than I planned before the peak heat. Can we be ready?" He calculated silently. "Yes, if we push for the next 8 days. Then we push." She folded the map herself and went to bed, and she lay there and thought about the fact that she had changed her position and that it had not felt like defeat. It had felt like thinking clearly. And she thought about what he had said, "I respect you enough to be honest," and she pressed her palms flat against the quilt and made herself breathe normally. They pushed for 8 days and they were ready. The drive began on a Tuesday morning in late June, with the sun coming up red through the eastern haze and the cattle moving slow and steady out of the south pasture and onto the trail. She had hired one additional hand, a young man named Pete Reardon, 19 years old and earnest in the way of people who have not yet had it beaten out of them. He was good with the horses and talked too much, and she found she did not mind him. Ira rode point. She rode swing. Pete rode drag. The cattle strung out along the trail in the way of cattle, unhurried and entirely indifferent to the human concern invested in their movement. The first 3 days were good. The trail was well used but not crowded. The water sources Ira had identified were sound, and the cattle held together better than she had expected. She and Ira rode parallel for long stretches in the mornings, close enough to talk if they wanted to, far enough that neither had to. She found that the silence between them on the trail was different from the silence in other company. It was not empty silence or uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had decided that they did not need to explain their presence to each other. She had not had that kind of silence with another person since her father. On the 4th night, camped at a shallow creek off the main trail, she was tending the fire and Ira came and sat across from her, and she could see by the way he was sitting slightly forward, hands loosely clasped, that he was going to say something. "What?" she said. "Nothing yet," he said. "I am working up to it." She looked at him steadily. "You do not usually need to work up to things. This is different." She waited. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was open in a way she had not seen from him before, not vulnerable exactly, but unguarded, which on a man like him was nearly the same thing. "I like you, Naomi," he said. "I like you considerably, and I am not going to pretend I do not because I think you already know, and I think pretending otherwise would be disrespectful to both of us." She was very still. The fire shifted between them. "I am not asking you to be anything you are not," he continued. "I am not asking you to be easier or softer or more agreeable or any of the things I expect people have asked you to be. I am just telling you where I stand." She looked at him for a long time. "I am not soft," she said. Her voice was measured. It was almost a warning. He met her eyes. "I have never asked you to be," he said simply. The words landed differently than she had expected. She had been prepared for some version of course not, or "I know that," which would have been reassuring but would also have had the quality of concession, of a man adjusting his expectations. But he did not say it like a concession. He said it like a fact he had already accounted for, like something he had understood about her long before he said so, and had never found problematic. He said it like a man who had looked at exactly who she was and found it to be precisely what he wanted, not in spite of itself but as itself. She said, "I have not been easy to know." "No," he agreed. "You have been interesting to know, which is better." She looked back at the fire. "I am going to need some time," she said, "with this, with whatever this is." "I have time," he said. Pete Reardon was asleep on the other side of the fire, and the cattle were quiet and the night was very large around them. And she thought, "I am in considerable trouble, and the trouble feels like the best thing that has happened to me in years." On the 7th day of the drive, a group of 4 riders came alongside on the trail. They were heading the same direction, also driving cattle, and at first it seemed like simple trail traffic. But the riders kept pace with Naomi's herd rather than moving ahead, and after about an hour of this, their lead man rode over. He said his name was Dillard and he was driving 20 head north and the trail was getting tight. He said it pleasantly enough, but there was something in the way he said it that suggested the pleasantness was provisional. He said he supposed they would have to share the water at the next crossing, and he looked at her in the way men sometimes looked at her, with the idle assumption that she would defer or step aside or otherwise make herself convenient. She said, "We will share the crossing. There is water enough for both herds." Dillard said, "I suppose your man there agrees," she said. "My man there does as I direct, same as my other hand. If you have questions about this operation, you are asking them to the right person." Dillard looked at her and then at Ira and seemed to make a calculation. Ira was sitting easy in his saddle, not aggressive, not deferential, just watching with those quiet dark eyes that she had come to understand missed very little. The particular quality of Ira's stillness was, she suspected, something that most men correctly assessed as more serious than bluster. Dillard tipped his hat and said, "No offense, ma'am," and rode back to his herd. That evening she caught Ira watching her with an expression she now knew well enough to name, though she had not yet said the name aloud to herself. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She looked back at him for one long moment and then looked away, and she was smiling, which she allowed herself because the night was wide and dark, and no one was watching except perhaps Pete, who was young enough to be polite about it. On the 9th day it rained. Hard, genuine rain, the kind that turned trail into mud and mud into difficulty. The cattle moved slowly and badly, and the mood of the whole enterprise shifted into something grimmer and more effortful. She and Ira worked the edges of the herd for hours, keeping them on line, and by mid-afternoon she was soaked through and her horse was struggling in the mud, and she was grinding her teeth against the frustration of it. He came alongside her in the middle of a particularly bad stretch and said, "How are you holding?" "I am fine," she said. "You look like you are considering violence against several parties." Despite herself, she laughed. It surprised her. It was a real laugh, short and sudden, and it broke something that had been building behind her ribs since morning. He looked at her when she laughed with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she had to look away again. They made camp early that night, the cattle penned in a natural hollow. Pete built the fire and she and Ira strung a piece of canvas between 2 trees for some shelter from the remaining drizzle. They sat under it side by side, very close by necessity, eating cold beans from the tin because the fire was not hot enough for cooking proper. He said, "Tell me something about yourself that no one else knows." She considered the request. She could have deflected it. She said, "When I was 17, I wanted to go to normal school and become a teacher. My father did not have the money. I was not angry about it, but I put it somewhere, and I have not opened that somewhere in a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you still want it?" "I want this," she said, looking at the dark pasture where her cattle stood in the rain. "Genuinely, I am not telling you that story as a complaint. I am telling it because you asked for something true, and that is true." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I wanted to study engineering, bridges specifically. I read every book about it I could get my hands on. Then my mother died and the farm needed labor, and that was the end of that." She looked at him. "Do you ever think about it still?" "Sometimes," he said. "When I cross a good bridge, I look at how it was built." He paused. "I suppose we both redirected." "Yes," she said. "Though I think what we redirected toward was not nothing." He turned his head and looked at her, very close, the canvas low over them and the rain on it, and the firelight from Pete's fire catching the edge of his jaw. "No," he said softly, "it was definitely not nothing." She did not look away this time. She let herself look at him properly and openly, the way she had been carefully not doing for weeks, and what she felt was large and certain and faintly terrifying, and she did not retreat from it. She said in a very quiet voice, "Ira." He said, "I know." They sat like that for a while longer, and then she leaned her head just slightly against his shoulder, and he was very still for a moment, and then he was not, because he put his arm around her carefully, like a man who understood that care was what was called for, and she let him. Pete Reardon, across the fire, was demonstrably looking at the sky. They arrived in Abilene on a Wednesday morning 15 days after they left Harlan's Crossing. The cattle were in good condition. Ira had been right about the route, though she had arrived at the right answer herself, and the buyer she had arranged was a man named Forsyth who ran a legitimate operation and paid on time. She stood in his yard and did the transaction herself, as she had done every transaction herself, and when it was done, she had the money in her coat pocket and felt the clean, specific satisfaction of a thing completed. She paid Pete Reardon that afternoon generously, and he shook her hand with both of his and told her she was the best boss he had ever worked for, which made her feel something warm and slightly embarrassed. She told him he had done good work, and that if he was looking for a place to land he should come back to Harlan's Crossing. She found Ira at the livery stable, tending to the horses, and she stood in the doorway watching him work for a moment before she said anything. He was talking to her horse quietly, not words exactly, just sounds, and the horse was turned toward him with the particular alert attention of an animal that trusts something. "The sale went well," she said. He turned. "Good. I paid Whitfield's credit. I will go to the county seat before we ride home and file the full documentation on Harrow." She paused. "With the proceeds from the drive, I have enough to hire one permanent hand. The pay is fair. The work is steady. The boss is, by most accounts, not easy." She looked at him. "I am asking you to stay." He put down the brush he had been using on her horse. He looked at her with that full, still expression that she had come to understand was him being moved, because he moved inwardly rather than outwardly. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she repeated. "I am staying," he said. "That was never in question, Naomi. I have been waiting for you to say the word." She crossed the livery floor to him and stopped close, not touching yet but near enough that she could see the details of his face clearly, the crooked-heeled jaw, the dark eyes, the small line at the corner of his mouth that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. She said, "I have thought about this a great deal." "So have I," he said. "I have thought about all the ways it could be a mistake. And I concluded that the only actual mistake would be deciding that the risk of something real was less worth taking than the safety of something empty." She paused. "I learned that from my father, who gave things away freely. I am still learning the right application of it." He reached out and took her hand, just her hand, her rough, calloused, rope-worn hand, and held it in both of his and looked at it for a moment as if it were something worth looking at. Then he looked up at her. "I love you," he said. "That is where I have been for some time. I did not want to say it until you were ready to hear it." She looked at him and felt the thing in her chest expand until it was not manageable, until it was not something she could file away or redirect or carefully ignore, until it was simply what it was, enormous and genuine and entirely welcome. "I love you too," she said. "It is inconvenient and significant, and I would not trade it." He smiled, the full version this time, not the restrained one, the one that used his whole face, and she thought she had never seen anything she liked more. He pulled her gently closer and she went, and when he kissed her it was quiet and thorough, not performative, a kiss that had been coming for a long time and knew it. Pete Reardon, who had apparently followed them to the livery for reasons that were his own business, could be heard outside making a discreet and hasty departure. They rode back to Harlan's Crossing together, she and Ira, the 3 days back feeling different from the 15 days out. The sky was the same sky. The trail was the same trail. But she was aware of him differently now, in the way of someone who has named a thing, and found the naming did not diminish it but enlarged it. They talked more on the ride back, not more than was natural, but more openly, the way people talk when they have agreed to mean something to each other, and the meaning makes conversation easier. He told her about Missouri, about his brother Thomas who had a farm there and a wife named Lena and 2 children. She told him about her years in San Antonio, the boarding house where she had worked as a seamstress to support herself and her father, the city's specific noise and color, and the way she had missed open land even when she did not know she was missing it. She told him about the man in San Antonio, too, because she was honest, and because she thought he should know the context of some of her sharpness. "His name was David Carr," she said. "He was 30 and I was 20, and he found me interesting right up until interesting became inconvenient. He wanted me to become a different kind of woman. I was unable to accommodate him." "His loss," Ira said, without particular dramatics. "Yes," she agreed, "though it took me longer to arrive at that conclusion than I would prefer to admit." He looked at her from his horse. "For what it is worth," he said, "I am not interested in a different kind of woman. I am interested specifically in you as you are, which I want to make as plain as I can." She looked at the trail ahead of her. "You have made it plain," she said. "I am beginning to believe it." "That is progress," he said. She smiled at the trail. They arrived home on a Friday evening. Harlan's Crossing looked the same as it always had, dusty and permanent and vaguely stubborn, and her land beyond it looked like hers, which it was. She rode through the gate and it held on its reinforced hinges, and she felt, arriving home after 3 weeks away, something she had not expected to feel: gratitude. For the land, for the cattle that her neighbor had agreed to watch in her absence, for the small solid house her father had left her, and for the man riding in beside her. 3 days after their return, Naomi rode to the county seat with her documentation and filed a formal complaint against Court Harrow, citing the 3 incidents of fence cutting and stock interference, with dates, boot track measurements, and the testimony of Ira Fairchild as a witness who had been present for the last 2 incidents. She had written everything out carefully in her clear, deliberate hand, and she had the name of a county attorney who was known to be less susceptible to the kind of money Harrow spent. The process was not quick. It did not resolve itself in a week or even a month. But it began. And it began with documentation and with her own steady persistence, which was the only foundation she had ever trusted. Harrow made no further moves against her property. She suspected that the knowledge that she had files at the county seat was sufficient deterrence, at least for the time being. She also suspected that the knowledge that Ira Fairchild was now a permanent fixture on the Dalton land was part of his calculation, not because Ira was physically intimidating in the obvious way, but because Harrow was smart enough to recognize a man who would not back down, and Ira Fairchild was definitively that. The months moved. September turned gold, and then September turned cool. She brought in a modest sale in the fall, 12 head, local buyer, not the Abilene prices but decent. And she used the margin to hire Pete Reardon back for the winter, because the workload was genuine, and because she had decided that sustainable meant not trying to do everything alone forever. It had been a long time since she had admitted that anything was beyond her singular capacity. The admission did not feel like failure. It felt, if anything, like intelligence. Ira and she had not formally discussed what they were to each other, which was a conversation she was aware they needed to have eventually. But there was something in the ongoing dailiness of them, the shared meals, the long evening conversations, the easy working partnership of the daylight hours, the particular electricity that moved through her when his hand brushed hers while they were doing something completely ordinary. That made formal discussion feel simultaneously necessary and slightly redundant. They both knew. The question was how and when they were willing to say what came next. He said it on an October evening when the first real cold of the year was coming down from the north, and they were inside by the stove, and she was reading, and he was mending a harness, and the lamplight was warm and there was coffee on, and the whole domestic piece of it was so unexpected and so entirely right that she thought she might cry, which was not something she did as a general practice, but which she found herself occasionally willing to consider these days. He put down the harness. He said, "Naomi." She looked up. He said, "I want to marry you. I want to stay on this land, your land, and build something with you if that is what you want. I am not asking you to need me. I am asking you to choose me, which is entirely different." She set down her book. She looked at him for a long moment, and everything she had ever concluded about him moved through her. His steadiness, his honesty, his particular brand of intelligence that operated most fully in quiet rather than noise, the way he looked at her like she was exactly the person she had always intended to be. "Yes," she said, "I choose you." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his, and they were just still for a moment, very close in the lamplight with the October cold pressing at the glass. "I should say," she said, "that I am not going to become easy to live with." "I know," he said. "I am looking forward to it." They were married in the second week of November, 1882, in the Methodist Church in Harlan's Crossing, in a service presided over by a minister named Reverend Cole, who had a cold and spoke very quickly, which was fine with both of them. Pete Reardon stood beside Ira. The school teacher, a young woman named Clara Hinz, who had become the nearest thing Naomi had to a friend in Harlan's Crossing, stood beside Naomi. Calvin Briggs was there. Even Gus Whitfield came, which surprised her, though she suspected his motive was partly curiosity and partly the fact that she had paid her credit on time and was now one of his more reliable customers. She wore a blue dress she had made herself from cloth she had ordered, and the minister went through the words and she said the words back. And when she looked at Ira's face during the vows, she saw that the full version of his smile was present, and her own composure briefly held and then briefly did not. And she felt two things she did not expect: an enormous fullness that was happiness, specific and present, and a specific acute wish that her father had lived long enough to see this. She allowed herself both feelings. After the ceremony, in the small celebration at the church hall that Clara Hinz had organized with enthusiasm that Naomi had only partially resisted, she stood with a glass of cider and watched Ira talk to Calvin Briggs and thought, with the matter-of-fact clarity that was her characteristic mode, "I am very glad I did not talk myself out of this." Winter settled in. They were together in the house, working the land together, and the days had a different quality from before, fuller, richer, the way a thing has more color when it is seen in the right light. She was not transformed by love in the way stories sometimes insisted people were. She was not softened or lightened or otherwise altered into a different woman. She was still herself, direct, precise, occasionally difficult, certain in her opinions and willing to defend them, more comfortable in boots than in anything else she owned. But she was also genuinely happy, not the absence of misery kind of happy, but the actual presence of goodness kind. And she had someone who met her fully in that, who did not ask her to modulate or minimize or perform, who came back every day to the argument and the work and the evening fire with the same patient, genuine interest in exactly who she was. He wrote to his brother Thomas in Missouri in December. She read the letter over his shoulder because he offered. In it he wrote without embarrassment that he had found his place and his person, and that the place was Texas and the person was Naomi, and that he was, for the first time since he was 12 years old, not looking for something. She sat beside him for a long time after reading it. "Did you send it?" she finally asked. "Yesterday," he said. "Good," she said. January came with a hard frost that killed part of her winter pasture grass and required supplemental feeding for the cattle, which was an expense she had not fully budgeted for. She adjusted. She was good at adjusting. Ira spent 3 days repairing the barn's south wall against the cold while she reworked her accounts, and they talked through the numbers together in the evenings. And while the situation was tight, it was manageable. She had not come this far to be defeated by a January frost. Thomas Fairchild wrote back from Missouri. He addressed the letter to both of them, Ira and Naomi Fairchild, and it was a good letter, warm and specific, congratulating them and expressing a genuine hope that they would visit Missouri or that he and Lena would come south. Naomi read it 3 times. She had not expected to feel much about the idea of family in Missouri, but she found she felt considerable. She wrote back herself, a letter that Ira read and said was better than any letter he had ever written, which she suspected was at least partially true, and which she accepted without false modesty. The legal situation with Court Harrow resolved in the spring of 1883. It took longer than she had hoped, moved through the county attorney, and then through a land court proceeding that required her to ride to the county seat twice and provide testimony in writing once. But it resolved. Harrow was issued a formal censure and ordered to pay a fine equivalent to the value of the cattle interfered with and the fence damage, and a permanent record of the incidents was entered with the land court. It was not a jail sentence, and she had not expected one, but it was official and it was on record, and it cost him money and reputation both, and he left her alone after that with the thoroughness of a man who had decided the trouble was no longer worth it. She rode home from the county seat on the day the decision was entered with the particular feeling she imagined a soldier felt after a long campaign, not victorious exactly, not elated, but done. The thing was done. She had held on and documented and persisted, and it had mattered. Ira met her at the gate. He had clearly been watching for her. He took her horse and she climbed down stiffly from the saddle, and he looked at her face and read it the way he had learned to read it over the months they had been together. "It went your way," he said. "It went correctly," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him for a moment, not heavily, but genuinely, and he held her there in the late afternoon light, and she breathed. "Your father would have been proud," he said quietly near her hair. She pressed her eyes closed for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." Spring opened up around them in the slow, deliberate way of the Texas hill country, green showing in the pasture and the cattle moving differently, the way cattle moved when they were content. She and Ira began planning the second drive to Abilene, this time with Pete Reardon already contracted, and a second additional hand, a young woman named Rosa Salinas, 22 years old, whose father had been a vaquero, and who could rope better than anyone Naomi had seen since she had been in Texas. Naomi had hired Rosa in March and found she liked her enormously. There was a directness in Rosa that Naomi recognized and respected. Rosa and Pete got on well and then, gradually, got on in the way that was more than well, and Naomi found herself watching this development with an affection she had not expected herself to feel. She mentioned it to Ira one evening. "They are circling each other," she said. Ira looked across the yard to where Pete and Rosa were ostensibly checking saddle equipment, and were in fact talking very close together about something that had very little to do with saddles. "Yes," he said, amused. "I hope it does not become complicated," she said. "If it becomes anything like what happened in this house," he said, looking at her, "it will not be simple, but it will be worth it." She looked at him. "That is either very romantic or an indictment of both of us." "Yes," he he agreed, entirely unbothered. In May of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with that knowledge for 2 days before she told anyone, sitting with it the way she sat with important things in private, with full attention, turning it over and looking at it from every angle. She was 27 years old. The ranch was established and stable. The legal trouble was resolved. She had a husband she trusted completely, which was a thing she had genuinely not expected to be able to say at this point in her life, and she found she did not feel the fear she might have expected. She felt something larger and more serious than fear, a full and adult acknowledgement of what this meant, and underneath it, genuine joy. She told Ira on a Tuesday evening, directly and without preamble, the way she told him everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table and he came in from the barn and she said, "I am going to have a child." He stopped. He looked at her. She watched his face move through something large and private and real, and then he crossed the room and sat down across from her and reached across the table and took both her hands and said, "Naomi," very quietly, and stopped, because apparently that was all he had for a moment. "Are you all right?" She said. He laughed, which surprised her. Not a big laugh, a small, disbelieving one, the kind that happens when something is better than you had prepared for. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I am very all right." He looked at her hands in his. "Are you?" "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked up at her and what was in his face was enormous and clear and certain. "I will be here," he said, "for every part of it. I want you to know that without question." "I know that," she said. "I have known that for some time." He pressed her hands to his mouth and held them there, and she looked at the top of his head, at the dark hair that was getting a thread or two of gray at the temple this year. And she thought about how strange it was to trust a person completely, and how rare and how worth whatever it had cost. She told Clara Hinds the following week, and Clara's response was to immediately begin knitting something small and yellow, and to cry briefly and happily, which Naomi found excessive but also endearing. She told Rosa Salinas, who said, with characteristic brevity, "Good, you will be a fine mother." She told Pete Reardon, who turned red and said congratulations twice and then knocked over his coffee cup. The second drive to Abilene happened in June, before she was showing significantly, and it went well. Rosa turned out to be everything Naomi had hoped on the trail, capable and decisive and willing to work. The cattle arrived in good condition. The price from Forsyth was better than the previous year, and she rode home from Abilene with more money than she had had at any point since her father had sent her that deed, and a note in February of 1882. The summer moved through heat, and through the particular rhythm of a working ranch, demanding and satisfying in equal measure, full of small victories and small setbacks, and the ongoing dailiness of animals and weather and the land, which required everything and gave back everything in its own time. She and Ira worked through it together, alongside Rosa and Pete, and in the evenings she was tired in a different way than she had ever been tired before, a good and full tired, the kind that came from a day that had meant something. He was attentive without being anxious about her pregnancy, which she appreciated more than she could easily express. He watched her and he asked her how she felt, and he adjusted the work distribution without making it obvious he was doing so, and he was present in the particular way that she had come to understand was his version of devotion, not in the loud performative register, but in the unbroken steady one, day after day, the way a good fence held. There were nights when she could not sleep, lying heavy and warm in the summer heat with the child moving inside her, and she would lie and think about the shape of things, about the road from San Antonio to here, about her father's deed and her own stubbornness, and the man asleep beside her whose existence in her life still occasionally surprised her in the best possible way. She thought about all the ways this life could have not happened. If she had taken Harrow's offer and sold, if she had been less stubborn or more afraid, if she had talked herself out of Ira Fairchild because the risk of being known was greater than the risk of being alone. She had come very close some nights to doing exactly that. She was glad she had not. Their son was born in November of 1883, in the house, with the help of the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Barker who had been delivering babies in Harlan's Crossing for 20 years and who had seen everything. The labor was long and difficult, and Naomi was honest with herself about how hard it was, but she was also honestly equal to it, which she had suspected she would be. She was not soft. She had not needed to be soft for this. She needed to be what she was. Ira sat outside the door, and she knew he was there, and when it was done and Mrs. Barker called him in, she heard him cross the floor, and then he was beside her, and there was their son, small and dark-haired and frankly astonishing, the way new things were, and Ira's face was something she had no adequate words for. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like both of us," Ira said. "What do we call him?" They had talked about names. She had said she liked simple names, names that were their own rather than carrying too much weight. He had agreed. "I thought," he said carefully, "that we might call him James, after your father." She looked at the baby and then at Ira and felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped trying to name precisely, because naming it precisely was insufficient. "Yes," she said. "James." James Fairchild was a loud baby and then a loud toddler and then a loud child, and Naomi loved every decibel of him. He was his father's son in temperament, curious and thorough, and given to sitting very still and watching things carefully before acting, and he was his mother's son in stubbornness, which Ira pointed out on a regular basis with great enjoyment and no real complaint. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not in the boom-and-bust way that destroyed so many Texas operations in those years, but steadily and sustainably, the way things grew when you paid attention and worked in good faith and did not try to outrun your means. She expanded the herd gradually, added a second pasture, and eventually hired a second permanent hand when the workload genuinely required it. She drove to Abilene every summer. She knew the trail now as well as she knew her own land. The legal case against Harrow had established something quietly important for her in the territory, a reputation for persistence that she had not deliberately cultivated but that had its uses. She was known in Harlan's Crossing as a woman who held her ground and documented her grievances and followed through, and while this did not make everyone like her, it made most people treat her with a respect that was more useful than affection. She was fine with that. In 1885, Pete Reardon and Rosa Salinas married in a small ceremony at the church that echoed Naomi and Ira's ceremony in its simplicity, and surpassed it considerably in the quality of Rosa's dress, which was remarkable. Naomi stood beside Rosa and Ira stood beside Pete, and James, who was not quite 2 years old, was managed by Clara Hinds during the ceremony with considerable effort on Clara's part. It was a good day. Rosa and Pete set up a small claim of their own 4 miles east, near enough to remain part of the working relationship but their own, and Naomi found the arrangement to be genuinely good for everyone. She and Rosa continued to work together on the drives, a partnership that was efficient and easy, and Pete and Ira had the particular friendship of 2 men who respected each other's work and did not require much else from each other, which seemed to suit both of them completely. Thomas Fairchild came from Missouri in the fall of 1885. He and Lena and their 2 children, on their way further west to visit a cousin in New Mexico, and they stopped at Harlan's Crossing for a week. Naomi liked Thomas immediately and found Lena to be a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth, and the week was full and easy in the way of people who were well matched even before they knew each other well. Thomas was like Ira in the quietness, and unlike him in the humor. Thomas was funny in a way that was front-facing and immediate, where Ira's humor was dry and came sideways, and she found the combination of them together to be more entertaining than most things she could think of. Thomas found Naomi, she could tell, both slightly formidable and entirely right for his brother. He said to her on the last evening on the porch while the others were inside, "I worried about him sometimes, moving around like that, not settling. I could not tell if he was looking for something or avoiding it." "I think he was looking," she said. "He found what he was looking for." Thomas looked at the land around them, the south pasture in the late evening, the barn with its sound roof, the horses by the fence. He did, he agreed. She thought about what Thomas had said for several days after. Not because it troubled her, but because there was something in it that she wanted to hold and look at. Ira Fairchild had been looking for something, had been moving for 9 years before he came to Harlan's Crossing, and what he had found was not just her but this land, this work, this particular shape of a life. And she had been doing something similar in her own way. Not moving in miles, but moving in the private interior sense of someone who had been holding herself at a deliberate distance from the risk of fully wanting something, because wanting something fully meant the possibility of fully losing it. She had wanted the land. She had allowed herself that want. The rest she had kept at a careful remove, until she had not. That evening she told Ira what Thomas had said, and Ira listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "He is not wrong. I was looking." He turned to look at her. "I did not know what I was looking for until I found it." She looked at him. "And now I am exactly where I intend to remain," he said. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, unhurriedly, and he turned his face toward her and they sat together on the porch in the early dark, his arm around her and her head against his shoulder. And James's small voice came from inside the house asking someone for water, and the land was quiet around them. Their second child came in the spring of 1887, a girl they named Caroline, after Naomi's mother. She was quieter than James from the first day, with Naomi's dark eyes and a watchful quality that was recognizably her mother's. James, who was 3.5, was initially suspicious of Caroline, and then gradually devoted to her in the protective older sibling way that Naomi had secretly hoped for. She watched him stand by the cradle one afternoon with his hands behind his back, examining his sister with the careful thoroughness of his father, and she felt something almost too large to contain. Ira came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the same scene, and he put his hand on her waist, and she covered it with her own. They stood like that without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The ranch in the years that followed was not a storybook operation. There were hard seasons and tight margins, and one terrible drought year in 1886 that cost her a third of the herd, and required everything she had in the way of ingenuity and patience to survive. But she survived it. They survived it. She was not soft, and she had never been asked to be, and the combination of her and Ira, her precision and his thoroughness, her stubbornness and his patience, made them effective in crisis in the particular way that two people who work well together are effective. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but genuinely and sustainably. And through all of it, through the drought and the recovery, and the legal follow-ups and the drives and the seasonal grind and the children growing and the land demanding, through all of it, every evening that was not impossible ended the same way. The two of them, on the porch or by the fire or in the kitchen with the lamp on, talking or reading or simply being present to each other in the ease that had developed between them over the years. The ease that had grown from something difficult into something so natural that she sometimes forgot briefly what it had felt like to live without it. She had not forgotten, actually. She was too careful a thinker to forget that kind of thing. She remembered exactly what it had been like before, the specific quality of a life that was hers and only hers, proud and sufficient and sometimes very solitary. She did not romanticize that solitude. It had been real and it had had its own integrity and she had lived it honestly. But this was better. She was willing, finally, to simply say that. This was better. In the summer of 1888, James was 5 and Caroline was 18 months, and the Dalton Fairchild Ranch, which she still called the Dalton land, and which Ira had never once requested she change, understanding that the name was a form of memory, was running 120 head, and had a reputation in the territory for sound stock and reliable dealing. She drove to Abilene that summer with Rosa and 2 other hands. Ira staying home with the children and the operations because they had reached the point where every drive did not require both of them. And she rode the trail that had been the first real test of what she and Ira were to each other. And she thought about that night under the canvas in the rain, leaning against his shoulder, and the specific quality of being known. She thought about what he had said by that first fire on that fourth night, when he had told her plainly where he stood, and she had told him she was not soft. She could hear his voice as clearly as if it were still the night it had happened. "I have never asked you to be." There had been no qualification in it, no subtext, no implication that softness was the ideal to which she had failed to measure up. It had been a statement of genuine acceptance, of seeing her as she was and finding that sufficient, more than sufficient, exactly right. She had needed in that moment to receive that. She had received it. And she had gone on receiving it, in the daily form of a man who came back to her every morning as though she was exactly who he had hoped she would be, and who went on doing that indefinitely, through difficulty and drought and the ordinary wearing of years. She completed the drive and came home to Harlan's Crossing in August, dusty and well paid and glad to be on her own land again. She came through the gate in the late afternoon, and James came running from the yard, and she got down from her horse and caught him, this sturdy dark-eyed 5-year-old who smelled of summer and horses, and whatever he had gotten into that afternoon, and she held him and he said, "Mama, Papa let me ride the fence line today," with the particular triumph of a child reporting a significant permission. "Did he?" she said. "He walked beside me the whole time," James reported, slightly less triumphantly. Ira came from the barn with Caroline on his hip, and she crossed the yard and took her daughter, who looked at her with the grave assessment that was her characteristic mode of greeting, and then leaned into her neck in the small definitive way that was 16 months telling her she had been missed. She stood there for a moment with Caroline against her neck, looking at Ira. He looked at her, the look she had been receiving for 6 years, the undiminished one, the one that had not worn down into something familiar and inattentive, but had, if anything, deepened as the years added context and detail, and the specific weight of shared experience to whatever he saw when he looked at her. "Good drive," he said. "Very good," she said. "We should talk numbers tonight." "Yes," he said. He took her horse and she walked into the house with her children, and she could hear him behind her, and through the kitchen window the sun was going down over the western pasture in the particular orange red of high summer, and the house was warm, and the land was hers, and the life was hers, and it was full. That evening, after James was asleep and Caroline was settled and the accounts were reviewed at the kitchen table and the lamp was burning low, she looked across at Ira and said, with the directness that was hers, "I want you to know something." He looked up from the papers. "Yes." "I want you to know that I am grateful," she said. "Not in a way that implies I owe you anything, because I do not think of it that way, but in the way of someone who knows the specific worth of a specific thing." She looked at him steadily. "I am grateful for who you are to me, and to this land, and to our children. I do not say it enough." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp made shadows and light move across his face, the familiar face she had been reading for years, the crooked jaw, the dark eyes, the small smile that lived at the corner of his mouth. "You say it every day," he said, "in the ways you choose to be. I hear it." She looked at him. "Good," she said. "I am glad you hear it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a while in the kitchen light, the accounts finished, and the children sleeping, and the land dark and quiet outside. And she thought, as she sometimes did when the particular fullness of this life was most present to her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, with exactly the person she had, against all her considerable resistance, chosen. She had told him she was not soft. He had said he had never asked her to be. And from that single honest exchange had come everything, all of it, the whole complicated and sturdy and deeply good shape of a life she had not known she was building until she was standing in the middle of it, and it was already worth more than she knew how to measure. The Texas sky was vast above their house. The cattle moved in the night pasture. James would wake before dawn demanding breakfast. Caroline would wake shortly after and look at the world with those dark, thoughtful eyes, and find it, apparently, acceptable. The land needed work in the morning, as it always needed work in the morning, and she would rise and do the work, and Ira would rise beside her and do the same, and the days would continue to be what they had always been, difficult and real and entirely, undeniably worth it.